Housing makes up a large part of the built environment in most cities. In Singapore, with over 80% of the population residing in social housing, the estates define much of the city-state's look and feel. But more than just appearance, public housing in Singapore has been woven into its DNA, defining where the city ends and home begins. In this episode, we trace the origins of public housing in Singapore and see how its future is being sketched out. In Singapore, public housing comes under the jurisdiction of the Housing and Development Board. Formed in 1960, HDB was tasked with undertaking a serious problem at the time.
The HDB was formed to tackle very chronic shortage of housing and also to deal with many of the dilapidated slums. HDB is already 52 years old. In the early days, of course, HDB built very basic housing. We wanted to build as fast as possible with a roof over the head of anyone who is eligible for a flat, but with running water, clean water, electricity, and sanitation. Very basic.
This was the very problem that Liu Tai-ke faced some 50 years ago. Toa Payoh New Town, one of the first new towns to be built in Singapore, was among his earliest projects. But he insisted that speed, volume, and lack of funds did not have to mean that design be compromised. Even in the rush to break the backbone of housing shortage, beauty could be attained.
What is beautiful? Beautiful doesn't mean expensive materials. Beautiful doesn't mean lots of features. In fact, a lot of buildings with the features and expensive materials are not beautiful. What is missing is proportion. In architecture, the key ingredient is proportion and geometry. How do you create shapes so that they fit in beautifully? And the rest are just frills. But if you get all the frills without getting these two things right, you are not having architecture.
For Liu Tai-ke, planning and designing public housing in Singapore in the late 1960s meant starting from ground zero. In the young nation, there was no precedent to build on or formulae to follow. But nothing was left to chance, mere instinct, or a stroke of genius. Everything was scrutinized and studied, as Liu saw his mandate as being not just to build flats, but also homes where people could find a sense of community. So he and his team of 20-odd sociologists embarked on one research study after another to discern people's real social needs and preferences.
I started studying books of British new towns and neighborhoods and began to realize that they were located 50 to 80 kilometers away from London. Because they were so far away, they wanted each new town to be self-sufficient in the sense that people don't have to commute from the new towns to the central London. So I felt that this concept of self-sufficiency was very important.
Self-sufficiency became the bedrock upon which his new towns were built. He and his team spent a year interviewing residents to find out what facilities were needed to make the new town concept work. In the end, they concluded that to be self-sufficient, a new town needed a population of at least 250,000. Within these towns, residents could have most of their needs met through the inclusion of department stores, shops, clinics, sports facilities, and schools. In time, people could find employment near their homes too, when light industries were incorporated in these towns.
Most Asian cities have serious traffic congestion problems. We are one of the few exceptions. And that's because we keep people in the new town as much as we can. Then I went further to study a neighborhood. How big should it be and how many and so on. We studied that. So I talked to my sociologist and he said, when a community is too large, too big a number, then they don't feel that they belong to each other. But if there's a right number, then they feel that there's a variety of people you can meet, but not so big that it becomes impersonal.
In HDB terms, they determined this was between 750 to 1,000 units, or about 2 to 3 hectares. This meant the block layout needed to be designed to facilitate interaction among neighbors.
I didn't like the long corridors because all the time I felt it was very impersonal. It's almost like pure access, but no sense of human community. That's the next level of community I'm talking about. So I got the sociologist back. I said, well, tell me what's the maximum number of neighbors that one would happily relate to. Beyond that, you don't. There's always a limit of tolerance. So they said it's about 7 families.
To do that, corridors were spliced shorter, allowing for more end units and smaller communities where neighbors could relate to one another. But that wasn't enough. Liu felt that at the higher levels of the town and neighborhood, communal space still needed to be created.
While the town centers and neighborhood centers were planned in a typical American suburban shopping center, but at the same time, I felt that in the public housing environment, we're not creating suburban shopping malls alone. The town centers and the neighborhood centers should be also civic centers, a place for people to gather. Of course, the green space between building blocks is very important for kids to play. I questioned everything we did. So I asked another sociologist, what's the use of town gardens? Without hesitation, he said, a place to escape. I said, what do you mean? He said, with all this high density, if you happen to quarrel with your wife or children, where do you go? Town gardens.
Self-sufficiency and good sensible design were not the only outcomes of all the planning that went into the public housing projects. In the end, Liu Tai-ke and his HDB colleagues won themselves 2 unexpected friends from the government. One was people from public health, since public health in Singapore improved significantly as a result of well-designed social housing. The other, the police force.
Police loved us because if you want to catch a criminal, all you do is you put 2 policemen, one at the bottom of each staircase, to catch them.
But the ultimate test was still the residents for whom he was building all these flats.
In 1969, every day in the newspaper, you read a reader's complaint letters. Oh, I've been living with my family in this squatter area for the last 30, 40 years. Why do you have to move me to this hostile high-rise building? Day after day, I read this. Then around this 69, then around 72, 73, the voice started to change. It says, I've been waiting for the last 3 to 5 years. Why are you not resettling me? So I knew that we have done the right thing.
Tackling the problem of housing shortage was crucial in enabling Singapore's subsequently swift progress. Supporting infrastructure bloomed naturally, resulting in compact neighborhoods and towns which are now iconic features of Singapore's landscape.